So, what makes you, well, you? It sounds like such a simple question, right? But the answer is honestly one of the most complex puzzles in all of science. In this explainer, we're going to dive into how psychologists actually build the theories that try to solve it.
I mean, we've all been there. Maybe you're staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. or looking in the mirror and that one massive question just hits you. Who am I, really?
It feels so personal, so philosophical. But for more than 100 years, science has been trying to get a handle on it too. So how do you take the mystery of you and turn it into something you can actually study scientifically? Well, let's break it down.
Okay, first things first, we've got to be clear on what we're even talking about. What's the real difference between a scientific personality theory and, just a personal philosophy or a good idea someone has about people? This is absolutely key. Philosophy, a lot of the time, is about how we should live. It's based on values. A scientific theory, on the other hand, tries to describe what is, based on actual evidence. Think about it. It's the difference between saying people ought to be more generous and asking what are the specific factors that cause a person to act generously. See the shift? But here's the cool part. A good theory isn't just a boring list of facts. It's this powerful mix. You start with the hard evidence, the data. But then you need a little bit of what's called controlled imaginative speculation to see the patterns, to connect the dots, and build a bigger picture that actually means something. So let's say we have a theory, this blend of evidence and smart guesswork. How in the world do we know if it's any good? Or if it's just, a wild shot in the dark? Well, it turns out psychologists have a kind of toolkit for figuring that out, for sorting the really solid theories from the flimsy ones. And this isn't just for academics in a lab. It's a question you can use to think critically about any claim you hear about why people do what they do. So, what's the first and maybe the most important tool in that toolkit? It's this idea, and it's a big one, falsifiability. It sounds kind of complicated, but the concept is actually pretty simple. For a theory to be scientific, there has to be a way to test it and potentially prove it wrong. If a theory is so vague that it can explain anything and everything you throw at it, well then it really doesn't explain anything at all. This is a fantastic example. Aristotle's idea made perfect sense, right? It felt like common sense. A feather falls slower than a rock. But because it was a specific, testable claim, someone could actually go out and test it and find out it was wrong. That is science in action. A good theory has to be brave enough to be proven wrong by reality. All right, next up in the toolkit, we have two partners in crime, reliability and validity. Think of it like a bathroom scale. If you step on it 5 times in a row and it says you weigh 500 pounds every single time, well, that scale is reliable. It's consistent, but it's definitely not valid. A valid scale is accurate. It measures what it's actually supposed to measure. Any good personality test has to be both. And trust me, the rigor doesn't stop there. Psychologists get super specific, drilling down into all these different kinds of validity to make sure their tools are absolutely on point. It's this intense level of detail that really separates scientific measurement from just, guessing. But, and this is a big but, even with all this science and all these tools, every single personality theory is built on a foundation of a few basic assumptions about what it even means to be human. And these underlying beliefs, they shape the entire theory. Here's one of the all-time classics. Determinism versus free will. Are we basically just a product of our past, our genes, our childhood, things beyond our control? Or are we truly the authors of our own stories, free to choose our path? Every theory falls somewhere on this spectrum, and a theorist's answer to this question changes everything. And that question of control flows right into another huge one, pessimism versus optimism. Are we humans kind of fundamentally doomed to struggle and be conflicted? Or is real change, real growth, and genuine happiness actually possible? You can often see a connection here. Theorists who lean toward determinism tend to be a bit more pessimistic, while a belief in free will often goes hand in hand with a more optimistic view of people. So, there you have it. You now have the basic theorist's toolkit, and with these ideas in your back pocket, you can start to build your own, much more informed view of what really makes people tick. The big takeaway here is that you are now officially equipped. The next time you hear someone make a big claim about human nature, you can ask the right questions. Is it falsifiable? Are their measurements reliable and valid? And what are their hidden assumptions about free will or human potential? These questions are what turn you from someone who just consumes information into someone who can think critically about it. Which, of course, leaves us with one last big question, and this one is for you. Now that you've seen how these theories get built and how they're judged, take a second and think about it. On these huge questions, free will, the potential for change, human nature, where do you stand? What's your concept of humanity?
Get ready, because we are diving into one of the biggest dramas in intellectual history. It's the story of a revolutionary thinker and the two brilliant students who would eventually challenge everything he stood for. And in doing so, they basically changed how we see our own minds. Forever.
But before we get into all that, let me ask you something. Who is actually in the driver's seat of your mind? Is it your conscious, rational self calling the shots? Or is there something else? Some deeper, hidden force pulling the strings behind the scenes? This very question is what obsessed the three thinkers we're looking at today.
I mean, you've got to remember, a little over a century ago, our inner world was pretty much uncharted territory, a total mystery. And into that darkness, one man lit a torch: Sigmund Freud. By mixing what he saw in his clinic with some really bold speculation, he basically invented the first modern theory of what makes us, well, us. Let's start with his game-changing approach. All right, first up, the man himself, Sigmund Freud. And let me tell you, his work wasn't just groundbreaking for its time, it is still wildly controversial to this day. It all started with an approach he called psychoanalysis. So, what exactly is psychoanalysis? Well, at its heart, it's a method for digging into the unconscious. He worked with a colleague, Joseph Breuer, and learned about this thing called catharsis, the idea that just talking out your problems can make you feel better. But he soon developed his own signature technique, free association. Instead of hypnosis, he would just have his patients talk, say whatever popped into their heads, no matter how weird or random it seemed. He was convinced it was like a secret hotline to their hidden thoughts and desires. And this is where we get to Freud's biggest, most explosive idea. He believed our behavior isn't just random, it's driven by these super powerful unconscious forces. And the main one he claimed was the sexual drive, or what he called libido. But hold on, for Freud, this wasn't just about what you're thinking. He argued that basically any pleasure, enjoying a great meal, making art, you name it, it all came from this one single primal drive. But, Freud's journey wasn't some smooth, straight line. Not at all. He hit this massive crisis in his mid-40s. He was chasing this theory that all neuroses, all these emotional problems, were caused by actual seduction in childhood. He was so sure he'd found the key, but the theory just wasn't working. It was falling apart, and that failure forced him to completely rethink everything. And what's really fascinating is how brutally honest he was about it in a letter to a friend. He laid out 4 big reasons for ditching his theory. First off, he admitted it never actually cured a single patient, not one. Second, if he was right, it meant a horrifying number of fathers, including his own, were predators, and he just couldn't accept that. Third, and this is a big one, he realized that the unconscious mind doesn't really know the difference between fantasy and reality. And finally, the evidence just wasn't there. So dropping this whole idea, it actually paved the way for one of his most famous, and most controversial concepts, the Oedipus complex. Okay, so Freud has built this whole world where our past and our biology are basically king. But not everyone in his inner circle was buying it. And that brings us to our first rebel, Alfred Adler, who had a totally different take on what makes us tick. And this slide just lays out the split between them perfectly. See, Freud was all about causality. He thought we were basically pushed around by things that happen in our past, by these biological instincts. Adler? He was on a totally different page. He believed in teleology, the idea that we're being pulled forward by our goals, by who we want to become. For Adler, it's not about where you've been, it's about where you're headed. And you know what? Adler's own life is the perfect example of his theory. He was a sickly kid, and at 5 years old, he almost died from pneumonia. But hearing the doctor tell his parents, "The boy is lost," that didn't crush him. No, it lit a fire under him. It gave him a goal. It drove him to overcome that physical weakness and become a doctor himself. He wasn't just a victim of his past sickness. He was actively being pulled toward his future as a healer. And this idea that we can shape our own lives is right at the heart of what Adler called creative power. He had this great analogy for it, the law of the low doorway. Think about it. If you come to a doorway that's too low, you have a choice, right? You can learn to duck, or you can just keep smashing your head against it. For Adler, life is just full of these low doorways, and we always have that creative power to choose how we're going to deal with them. So if Adler's break with Freud was like an intellectual divorce, the split with our next guy, Carl Jung, oh, that was deeply, deeply personal. You see, Freud had picked Jung to be his successor. He was the crown prince of psychoanalysis, which just made their eventual breakup all the more dramatic.
Even as a kid, Jung felt like he was two people in one. On the one hand, there was personality number one, the everyday schoolboy living in the present. But then, there was this number two personality, this wise, ancient old man who seemed to come from another time. And this feeling, this duality, it was a major clue for where his thinking would eventually go. Now, the relationship between Freud and Jung was wow. It was intense. Jung actually wrote to Freud and confessed that his admiration for him was like a religious crush, and even had what he called an undeniable erotic undertone, and he connected this intense feeling to a terrible experience from his youth when he was sexually assaulted by an older man he had looked up to. You can just imagine how this incredibly complex personal stuff probably poured gasoline on the fire of their eventual falling out.
And this is where Jung really breaks away. He didn't just tweak Freud's ideas, he completely redrew the map of the human mind. He said, okay, sure, we have a personal unconscious, our own memories and feelings, but underneath that, there's something much deeper, something he called the collective unconscious. He saw it as this shared reservoir of memories and images that we all inherit from our ancestors, from the entire history of our species, packed with these universal symbols he called archetypes.
But Jung wasn't just some abstract theorist. He created practical tools, too. Take his word association test. It was basically a way to go hunting for what he called complexes. You know, those emotionally charged knots of thought we all have. So he'd read a list of 100 words, and he'd be watching everything. How long does it take you to answer? How's your breathing? Are you blushing? A long pause, a stutter, a failure to respond at all. Any of these could be a little red flag, a sign that the word just hit a raw nerve buried deep in the unconscious.
And this right here, this is probably Jung's most famous legacy, something you've almost definitely run into. He came up with two basic attitudes, extroversion and introversion, and then 4 ways we experience the world: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. You can see on the slide how when you mix and match them, you get these 8 basic psychological types. Sound familiar? It should. This is the direct ancestor of tests like the Myers-Briggs that are so popular today.
So, there you have it. You start with one revolutionary thinker, and from that single point you get 3 giants of psychology who carved out 3 totally different paths. Sure, they fractured the whole movement, but in doing so they left behind this incredibly rich and complicated legacy that we're still grappling with.
So let's just boil it all down, right? You had Freud, who said it's all about the unconscious sexual drive, and that we're basically pushed by our past. Then you have Adler, who believed we're all about striving to be better, that we're pulled toward our future goals. And finally, there's Jung, with his idea of a collective unconscious, arguing that we're all on this quest for wholeness, trying to balance our inner and outer worlds.
And all of this brings us right back to that question I asked at the very beginning. Who's really in the driver's seat? Is it Freud's version, with all these hidden drives from your childhood pushing you along? Is it Adler's, with your future goals pulling you forward? Or is it Jung's idea, that there are these ancient universal symbols shaping you from deep within? It's amazing. These ideas are a century old, and they are still battling it out for how we understand ourselves. So the real question isn't just who's in the driver's seat, it's which one of them is driving you.
Today, we are diving into one of the most revolutionary and, controversial figures in all of psychology, Melanie Klein. She took Freud's ideas and just ran with them, straight into the mind of a newborn baby. And what she said she found there, well, it changed everything. Okay, let's get into it.
But first, you have to understand this central, kind of heartbreaking paradox about her. This is the woman who built her entire theory on the absolute primal bond between a mother and child. And yet, her relationship with her own daughter, Melita, was completely and totally shattered. We're not just talking about a disagreement. Melita publicly blamed her own mother for her brother's death. This incredible personal tragedy is the key, you know? It's the lens through which she saw the entire human psyche.
And that lens, wow, it was shaped by an almost unbelievable amount of loss. To really get a grip on Klein's theories about anxiety, aggression, and all that inner turmoil we feel, you first have to understand the tragedies that basically defined her entire life. I mean, just look at this timeline. It is one gut punch after another. At 18, she loses her father.
Okay, tough. But then just 2 years later, her absolute favorite brother, Emmanuel, dies, and it devastates her. A year after that, she marries his friend, a choice she really came to regret because it basically slammed the door on her dream of becoming a doctor. And then, in 1934, her own son, Hans, dies. This constant, relentless exposure to death and grief wasn't just a sad backstory, it became the actual raw material for her life's work.
So let's step away from Klein's external world for a second and dive into the internal one she theorized about. She asked a question that was, for its time, just wild. What is actually going on inside the mind of a newborn baby? And her answer? Well, it would go on to shake the foundations of psychology.
So a lot of people back then, including Anna Freud, kind of saw babies as these cute, blank slates. Klein argued the complete opposite. She said, from the second a baby is born, it has an ego. Sure, it's primitive, it's disorganized, but it's there. And it's strong enough to feel deep anxiety, to use defense mechanisms, and, this is the crucial part, to start forming relationships with the world. And this right here is the cornerstone of her entire object relations theory. For Klein, a baby doesn't connect with a whole person at first. That's too complex. Instead, it connects with parts, or objects. And what's the very first object? The prototype for every single relationship we will ever have in our lives. The mother's breast. It's not just about food, it is the absolute center of that baby's emotional universe. And this is where it gets really fascinating. Because that first object, it isn't just one thing, it's two. And this brings us to what is probably Klein's most famous and influential idea, splitting.
So, here's the key. For an infant, the world is completely black and white. There are no gray areas. When the baby's hungry and gets milk, it experiences the good breast. That's love, that's security, that's everything wonderful. But when the baby's hungry and crying and the breast isn't there, it experiences the bad breast. That's frustration, anxiety, even persecution. The baby's mind can't yet understand that this is the same breast in two different states, so it splits it into two totally separate things. So what happens to these two completely opposite images? Well, the infant takes them inside. It swallows them whole, metaphorically speaking. This process is called introjection. The baby literally internalizes a perfect, loving object and a hateful, frustrating one. And according to Klein, these two images become the fundamental, rock-solid building blocks of our ego, of our whole inner world.
Okay, so let's see how this all comes together. This early process of splitting things into good and bad and then taking them in. This isn't just some quirky phase babies go through. Klein argued that this creates the very blueprint for our personality and for every single relationship we have for the rest of our lives.
And this just lays out the whole process perfectly. First, you have the raw experience. Then, the baby's mind splits that experience into all good or all bad. Third, it introjects. It pulls those split images inside. And finally, that's how we develop. Our sense of self, our ego, literally forms around these internal objects. You ever wonder why as adults we can sometimes see a person as a perfect angel one day and a total monster the next? Klein would say that pattern was born right here, in these very first moments of life.
As you can imagine, these ideas were nothing short of explosive. I mean, they put this immense psychological complexity inside the mind of an infant. It sparked fears, bitter debates in the psychoanalytic world. But you know what? Their influence was absolutely undeniable. Her legacy is just enormous. She pioneered using play as therapy for kids, realizing that for a child, their games and their toys are their words. That's how they show you their unconscious world. She also insisted that psychoanalysis wasn't just for troubled kids. It could help healthy kids too. And she was a huge influence on so many later thinkers, especially John Bowlby, who actually studied with her and then went on to develop his groundbreaking attachment theory. But her rise was full of conflict, and her most famous professional showdown was with Sigmund Freud's own daughter, Anna Freud. It was a fundamental clash of ideas. Anna basically argued that you can't properly analyze young children because their unconscious minds aren't developed enough. And Klein, as we've seen, said the complete opposite, that an incredibly rich, chaotic, powerful fantasy life exists from the moment of birth, making early analysis not just possible but critical. Their disagreement literally split the British Psychoanalytical Society in two. So, in the end, you see this powerful, unavoidable connection, a life that was just defined by so much loss and so many broken relationships. It gave birth to a theory that was obsessed with our very first bonds, our deepest anxieties, and the internal objects, both good and bad, that every single one of us carries around inside. Which really leaves us with a provocative question to chew on, doesn't it?
The next time you find yourself putting someone on a pedestal or completely demonizing them, just take a second and ask yourself, how much of that is reality and how much is just the echo of a tiny infant's first great divide?
So, what if our deepest anxieties, the things that keep us up at night, aren't really about us? What if they're about the world we live in? Today, we're diving into the work of Horney, a truly revolutionary psychoanalyst who wasn't afraid to challenge the father of the field, Sigmund Freud. And, in the process, she completely changed the game.
This one sentence right here, this was the bombshell. This idea put Horney on a direct collision course with the entire psychoanalytic establishment of her day. And to really get why this was so radical, we have to first understand the world she was pushing back against.
And make no mistake, that world was built pretty much brick by one person, Sigmund Freud. His theories weren't just ideas. Back then, they were basically the law of the land in psychology. At the heart of Freud's thinking was this idea of causality. Basically, who you are today is almost entirely determined by things that happened in your past, especially way back in your childhood. He saw people as being trapped in this constant internal battle between Eros, the life instinct, and Thanatos, the death instinct. We were just doomed to repeat these old patterns over and over again. And this all tied back to his big idea of biological determinism. You've probably heard the phrase, anatomy is destiny. Well, that was the absolute foundation of his theory. For Freud, pretty much everything, our fears, our dreams, our ambitions, it could all be traced back to our biology, to these deep-seated primal drives. Okay, so into this world, this very rigid Freudian world, steps Horney. And what's so fascinating is that she started out as a true believer. She trained with one of Freud's inner circle, but eventually she became one of his sharpest critics. You can really see her evolution here. I mean, she learned the rules of psychoanalysis from the inside, from the very top. And that deep understanding is what gave her this unique perspective. It gave her the insight, and honestly the courage, to see where the theories just weren't matching up with the real people she was trying to help. And this is where we get to the heart of her break with Freud. It all came down to a huge disagreement about what really makes us tick. You could almost call it a showdown, biology versus society. This right here, this comparison, really captures the revolution she started. It's so simple, but so powerful. She basically grabbed the psychoanalytic lens and just refocused it. She shifted it from looking inward at our bodies to looking outward at the world around us. Horney argued that if you really want to understand a person, you can't just look at their biology. You have to look at the culture that's shaping them every single day. And this was her critical point. For Horney, our anxiety isn't mainly coming from some internal, instinctual conflict. No, it's a direct result of external pressures from our society. The things that make us feel insecure, conflicted, and, well, neurotic. She believed they are products of the specific time and place we happen to live in. But Horney didn't just stop there and say, hey, culture matters. She went way deeper. She developed this incredibly powerful theory to explain exactly how our culture cooks up all this anxiety. She called it the vicious circle. She saw modern society as this engine of neurosis because it teaches us to want completely opposite things at the same time, which, of course, creates this constant state of internal conflict. I mean, does any of this sound familiar to you? This is the impossible situation she described so perfectly. We are constantly being pushed and pulled in opposite directions. Think about it. Society tells us, be a kind, humble team player, but also, you better be the #1 star. It screams about hustle culture and striving for more, while at the same time preaching about the importance of mindfulness and work-life balance. It tells you you can be anything you want to be, but oh yeah, here are all the reasons you can't. So what happens to a person's mind when you're constantly living with these conflicting pressures? Well, Horney had a very clear and pretty compelling answer. It creates a feedback loop. See, the anxiety that bubbles up from all these cultural contradictions, it leads us to develop these neurotic coping strategies, like an obsessive need for affection, or a desperate grab for power, or trying to win social approval at all costs. But those behaviors just end up creating more anxiety. And around we go. The circle really does become vicious. So, why are we still talking about Horney today? Why does her psychoanalytic social theory feel maybe more relevant now than ever before?
Well, her contributions just fundamentally changed the entire conversation in psychology. By shifting the focus away from our fixed biology and onto our ever-changing culture and relationships, she opened the door for a much more holistic, more relevant, and I think a more hopeful way of looking at human personality.
If there's one thing to take away from all this, it's Horney's invitation. She's asking us to look not just inward at our personal history, but also outward, at the culture that's molding us every single day. Her work is this powerful reminder that we are all products of our time and place. And maybe understanding those societal pressures is the real first step to understanding ourselves.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. How do those pressures to be humble but win, to strive endlessly, to be free but feel totally restricted, how do they show up in your own life? Horney's work suggests that really sitting with that question might just be the key to our own psychological well-being.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the work of psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, who really zeroed in on a strange paradox right at the heart of modern life. So let's just start with a question that might feel a little too familiar. Have you ever felt totally overwhelmed by all your choices? Or maybe you felt this weird kind of loneliness, even though the world offers you seemingly endless possibilities.
Well, Fromm had a really powerful take on this. He argued that this feeling isn't some personal failing on your part. No, he saw it as a central conflict of just being human, a paradox that's baked right into our existence.
To really get his answer, we have to start where he did, with what he called the fundamental human dilemma. This idea is basically the cornerstone of his entire theory of humanistic psychoanalysis.
Okay, think about it like this. We are animals. We're part of nature. But we're the only animal that knows it. Our self-awareness, our ability to reason, it basically rips us out of that seamless union with the natural world, and that leaves us with this deep, nagging sense of being separate and alone.
And here's where the paradox really kicks in. As humanity moved forward, we gained more and more freedom, right? Freedom from the harshness of nature, from rigid social roles. But Fromm's big point was that this very freedom actually made our feelings of isolation even worse.
All that freedom can be downright terrifying. So what do? Instead of leaning into it, Fromm said we come up with these clever psychological strategies, what he called mechanisms of escape, to run away from the very individuality that we fought so hard to get.
Fromm pointed to three main escape routes. First, there's authoritarianism. This is where we try to fuse with something bigger, a powerful leader, an institution, to feel whole again. And this can go two ways. You can submit to that authority, which is masochistic, or you can try to control and dominate others, which is sadistic. The second escape hatch is destructiveness. If you feel powerless against the world, the impulse might be to just try and tear it down. And finally, the one he saw is most common in our society, conformity. We just give up our individuality to blend in with the crowd, to become part of the herd.
So, if we're so busy trying to escape this loneliness, what are we running towards? Fromm believed our behavior isn't just random. He said we're driven by 5 powerful core human needs, all pushing us to reconnect with the world.
And here they are: relatedness, transcendence, rootedness, a sense of identity, and a frame of orientation. These are the big 5. They are the fundamental drives pushing us to solve that human dilemma and find our place again.
First up, relatedness. This is the big one, our most basic drive. It's that deep need to connect with other people, to overcome that feeling of being separate. It's the engine behind our friendships, our families, our communities, everything.
Next is transcendence. And this one has 2 sides. We all have this urge to rise above just being a passive creature, to make a mark. We can do this productively, by creating things, by caring for people and projects. Or we can do it destructively, through what Fromm called malignant aggression, hurting and destroying just for the sake of it.
Then we have rootedness. We can't go back to being one with nature, right? So we have to find new roots. This is our need to feel at home in the world, whether that's connecting with a place, a community, or a set of traditions.
And of course, there's our sense of identity. This is that deep drive to be able to say, I am me, to see ourselves as a unique individual. It's the total opposite of conformity, where we just borrow our identity from whatever group we're in. And finally, to make sense of it all, we need a frame of orientation. You can think of this as your personal roadmap, your philosophy on life. Without one, we're just lost. But with one, we have a stable way to understand the world and our place in it.
So how we actually go about trying to satisfy these 5 needs, that's what really defines our character. And Fromm said there are basically 2 ways to do it. You can take healthy, productive paths, or you can take unhealthy, what he called non-productive ones. He laid out a few of these non-productive styles. You've got the receptive type, who thinks all good things come from outside themselves, so they just passively wait to receive them. Then there's the exploitative type, who agrees the good stuff is out there, but they're going to aggressively take it. And the hoarding type, who finds security by just holding on tight to what they have, keeping everything locked away. So what's the healthy option? Fromm called it the productive orientation. This is all about actively using our uniquely human powers, our ability to work creatively, to love other people genuinely, and to think for ourselves, to connect with the world while still being our own unique person.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway here? Where does this all lead? For Fromm, this wasn't just some academic exercise. It was all about using these ideas to live a fuller, freer, and more connected life.
He really believed that the whole point of his humanistic psychoanalysis was incredibly simple: self-knowledge, for people to come to truly know themselves. Because without that, he argued, we can't solve that human dilemma. We can't really connect with the world or anyone else in a healthy way.
And that really leaves us with one final crucial question to turn back on ourselves. A question that brings Fromm's entire philosophy right into our own lives. Are you using your freedom to build genuine connections, or are you just using it to escape?
All right, let's jump right into a theory today that might just flip the way you see yourself and, well, everyone around you. It all starts with one kind of wild question. Seriously, think about that for a second. That solid, core you that you feel inside, the one you assume is always there and always the same, what if it's not really a thing? What if your personality isn't something you have, but something that happens between you and other people? Now that is a radical idea. It comes from an American psychiatrist named Harry Stack Sullivan. And what he argued was that our whole concept of a single individual personality, well, it's a myth. And that one thought is the entire foundation of his interpersonal theory. So, let's get into it. Who was this guy, Harry Stack Sullivan? He was a total pioneer, really. He shifted psychiatry's focus from what's going on inside someone's head to looking at the space between people, because that, he believed, is where personality truly lives. Okay, I know that sounds a little academic, but let's break it down. He's not talking about internal traits like you're shy or you're outgoing. He's defining personality as a pattern of situations with other people. This means the you who talks to your boss is a genuinely different personality than the you who hangs out with your best friend. For Sullivan, you're not just playing different roles, you are, in a very real way, different people. And bam, there it is. This says it all. It's a pretty startling thought, right? That you're not one single entity, but a collection of relational selves. The big takeaway here is that you are being constantly co-created in the space between you and everyone you meet. So, if our personality is just a pattern of interactions, what's driving those patterns? What's the engine? For Sullivan, it all comes down to a constant balancing act between 2 fundamental tensions that are always pulling at us. On one side, we have our needs. He called these conjunctive forces because they bring us together. You know, an infant's need for tenderness, for food, those things connect them to their caregiver. But on the other side, we have anxiety, and that's disjunctive. It's a social thing that pushes us apart. It's that awful feeling of disapproval or insecurity that just wrecks our relationships. So, our personality? It's basically the unique strategy we each come up with to get our needs met while doing everything we can to avoid that anxiety. So for Sullivan, growing up wasn't about hitting some internal psychic milestones. Nah, it was a story about our social world getting bigger and bigger. You don't just grow up, you grow up with other people. And the cast of characters who matter most is always changing. We start out with just the mothering one. Then our world expands to include playmates, then whole peer groups. But then comes a stage that was absolutely crucial for Sullivan, finding a chum. This is that first real, intimate best friend, someone outside your family who you learn to care about just as much as you care about yourself. From there, each stage throws new interpersonal challenges at us, shaping the way we relate to people for the rest of our lives. Now we're getting to what I think is Sullivan's most profound and, honestly, most hopeful idea. In a world that seems obsessed with what makes us all different, he came up with a concept that focuses on what actually unites every single one of us. Just let that one sink in for a minute. Everyone is much more simply human than otherwise. This is the very heart of what he called the one genus hypothesis, and it's just a massively powerful statement about our shared humanity. What he meant by this is that despite all the surface-level stuff that makes us seem different, our fundamental human experiences, our needs, our anxieties, our desire for connection are profoundly similar. Sullivan believed this shared foundation is the only reason we're even capable of having real empathy and connection in the first place.
Okay, so what does all this mean for mental health? Well, think about it. If personality is interpersonal, then it makes sense that our problems are interpersonal too. And this idea completely reframes how we think about psychological struggle.
This is so important. For Sullivan, a mental disorder wasn't some kind of disease inside your brain. It was a signpost pointing to inadequate or anxiety-filled relationships. The problem isn't in you. The problem is between you and other people. What a perspective shift, right?
And his approach to therapy flows directly from this. It's basically a lab for relationships. The therapist's job is to first help you see where your difficulties are. But then, and this is the key part, the relationship with the therapist becomes the main tool. They engage in a real face-to-face relationship with you, right there in the room, to help you see your patterns clearly and find healthier ways of connecting with people, ways that aren't all distorted by anxiety.
Which brings us right back to that central question. Sullivan's theory really challenges us to stop asking, who am I, and instead to start asking, who am I with you? So think about your own life. Who are you with your partner? Who are you with your colleagues, your friends? The answers might just reveal the complex, ever-changing, relational truth of who you really are.
Have you ever just felt completely lost? Asking yourself that huge question, who am I? Well, today we're diving into the life and work of Erik Erikson. He's the thinker who actually gave that feeling a name, the identity crisis. And for him, it wasn't just a theory. He lived it.
Seriously, it's one of the biggest questions we ever ask ourselves. And for Erik Erikson, this wasn't some abstract puzzle. Nope, it was the absolute defining struggle of his own life, and it ended up shaping his entire view of how we grow as human beings.
So picture this, a young Erik Erikson. Before he ever wrote a single word about psychology, he spent 7 years just drifting. He was a wandering artist, a poet, roaming across Europe, feeling totally confused and exhausted, just trying to figure out where he fit in the world.
Okay, so how does that happen? How does a personal, messy search for identity lead someone to create this revolutionary map of the entire human lifespan? Let's get into it.
Well, his life took this massive turn. An old friend invited him to come teach at a brand new school in Vienna. And it just so happened that his boss and his personal psychoanalyst was going to be Anna Freud. Yep, Sigmund Freud's daughter.
Now, what's really important here is that Erikson didn't just throw out Freud's work. Not at all. He built on top of it. He took Freud's ideas and dramatically expanded them, stretching the map of development from just childhood to the entire course of a life. This is really the heart of post-Freudian theory.
And here's the key difference. Freud was all about psychosexual stages, driven by our biology. But Erikson, he argued that our development is fundamentally psychosocial. He said, hey, it's our interactions with society and our culture that shape us. And it doesn't just happen in childhood, it happens across our entire lives. He based this whole idea on what he called the epigenetic principle. Now, that sounds complicated, but think of it like a plant growing from a seed. Our personality unfolds in a set sequence, step by step. Each stage presents a new challenge, and how we handle that challenge sets us up for the next one. It all builds on itself. So what does this map of life actually look like? Well, Erikson laid out 8 distinct stages, and each and every one is defined by a unique psychosocial crisis, a turning point that we have to navigate in order to keep growing. He outlined 8 stages in total. Now, we're not going to go through all of them, but let's zoom in on a few of the really big ones, the turning points that truly define the journey, starting right from the very beginning.
It all starts here, in infancy. The big question is, can I trust this world? If a baby's needs are met, if they feel safe and cared for, they learn to trust. And when you successfully get through this, you build the core strength of hope, this fundamental belief that things will be okay, which you carry into every challenge that comes next.
All right, let's jump forward to a stage that most of us probably remember, maybe a little too well. That time of intense self-discovery, of questioning everything, and trying on a dozen different personalities to see what fits.
This, right here, is the identity crisis that Erikson himself knew so well. It's that intense, sometimes chaotic period where you're trying to figure out how all the different parts of you, student, friend, son, daughter, fit together into one coherent person. If you navigate this successfully, you build fidelity, the ability to be true to yourself. Then, later in life, our focus starts to shift outward. We start asking, what am I contributing? What can I offer the next generation? This is the crisis of generativity versus stagnation. We feel this deep need to create or nurture things that are going to outlast us. And the virtue that comes from this? It's care, a real commitment to the future. And that idea of care, well, it brings us to a really profound and difficult irony in Erikson's own life. A moment where his personal story clashes, pretty dramatically, with his own theories.
So the very man who defined the importance of trust and care made a truly devastating choice. He institutionalized his own son, Neil, who was born with Down syndrome, and then he hid his existence from his other children for 20 years. It's a painful contradiction, a moment where the man just failed to live up to the incredible ideals of his life's work.
But, despite these really deep personal complexities, Erikson's ideas have had a massive, lasting impact on how we think about ourselves and this whole journey of being human. I mean, really, his greatest gift was giving us the language for a universal experience. By coining the phrase identity crisis, he gave all of us a way to understand that feeling of being lost and to talk about that vital search for who we are. He also had a really clear message about what makes for a meaningful adult life. He basically said that true fulfillment isn't about focusing on yourself endlessly. It's about looking beyond yourself, avoiding that feeling of stagnation, and contributing to the world and to the people who are going to come after you. But if there's one big, powerful idea to take away from Erikson, it's this. Life is a continuous journey of growth. We are not just prisoners of our childhood. At every single stage, there are new challenges, new crises to solve, and brand new opportunities to evolve and become a more complete version of ourselves. So, as we wrap this up, maybe take a second and ask yourself, where are you on Erikson's map? What's the central challenge you're navigating, and what's the core strength you're trying to build right now?
All right, let's talk about one of the most famous ideas in all of psychology, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're going to frame this as a climb, a journey up a mountain, because this isn't just some dusty old theory. It's a map that can help us understand what truly drives us and what we're capable of. So let's get ready to start the climb.
So, before Maslow came along, the world of psychology was, well, it was a little bit grim. You had thinkers like Freud, who basically said our lives are just one long battle with unconscious baggage from our childhood. Then you had others who saw us as simple creatures, just responding to rewards and punishments. But is that really the whole story? Are we really just stuck between our past and whatever cookie someone is dangling in front of us?
You can really see the two worlds colliding here. On one side, you've got this older, kind of pessimistic view where everything is determined for us, life is a struggle, and psychology's main job is to figure out what's wrong with you. But then, humanistic psychology came along, and it was this radical, optimistic breath of fresh air. It said, hold on, people have free will. Life isn't a struggle, it's a journey toward growth. It completely flipped the script from focusing on sickness to focusing on health and potential.
And the guy right at the center of this more hopeful science was Abraham Maslow. He just couldn't accept that we were nothing more than a bundle of symptoms or a series of learned behaviors. He had this deep belief that to really understand people, you couldn't just study the broken parts. You had to study people at their absolute best. And this quote, wow, it tells you everything about where he was coming from. He actually went to medical school for a short time when he was young, and he was horrified by it. He saw these surgeons who were amazing at their jobs, technically, but they treated people like a machine with broken parts. Maslow knew, deep down, that we're so much more than that. He wanted a psychology that treated people as whole, feeling human beings.
You know, his early life really explains a lot. He grew up facing a lot of prejudice, and books became his safe place, his escape. That experience, plus seeing that cold, detached view of people in medicine, it all pushed him to find a better way, a more complete and human way to understand what makes us tick.
And that brings us to his famous hierarchy. The best way to think about it is like building a pyramid or climbing a mountain. It all has to start with a solid base. You can't just teleport to the top. You have to build from the ground up, step by step.
So, the first two levels are what we could call our survival needs. At the very bottom, you've got physiological needs. This is the absolute stuff of life.
Air, water, food, shelter. I mean, if you can't breathe, you're not worrying about your career path, right? Once that's covered, we immediately look for safety. We need to feel secure, to have some order and predictability in our lives, to be free from constant fear. These two layers are the bedrock everything else is built on.
Okay, so once you have that foundation, you're fed, you're safe, you can start looking up. The next part of the climb is all about our social and psychological needs. This is where we go from just surviving to actually living and connecting with other people. Right after we feel safe, the next thing we're hardwired to seek out is connection. This is a huge one. We have this deep, powerful need for friends, for intimacy, for belonging to a tribe or a family. Maslow is really clear on this. Love isn't a luxury, it's an essential nutrient for a healthy psyche. Now, this is one of Maslow's most fascinating ideas about love. He noticed that how much love we get early on changes how we pursue it later. People who never ever receive love might actually stop being able to give it. People who get plenty of love grow up healthy and secure. But it's that middle group, the people who only got a small taste of love. They're the ones who are the most fiercely motivated, sometimes almost desperately, to find it for the rest of their lives.
So once we feel like we belong, the next thing we need is esteem. And this has two sides to it. There's the esteem we get from other people, respect, recognition, a good reputation. But just as important, if not more so, is self-esteem. That's the feeling of strength, of competence, of knowing you're capable and independent.
And that brings us to the peak, the summit of the mountain. This is the idea that really made Maslow's theory so revolutionary. It's not about filling a hole or fixing something that's broken. It's about reaching for the very best version of yourself.
So what does self-actualization really mean? It's the drive to become everything that you are capable of becoming. It's that inner pull to fulfill your unique potential. If you're a painter, you need to paint. If you're a teacher, you need to teach. It's about becoming, the most you can possibly be. It's not a destination, it's a constant process of growth.
So, what does this actually look like in a real person? Well, Maslow found they share some common traits. They tend to think about big philosophical questions, not petty drama. They're very comfortable being alone. They're guided by their own inner compass, not by what everyone else thinks. They have a strong sense of right and wrong, and they just have a knack for knowing what really matters. So, we've made the climb, we're at the top, and we're looking out. What's the big takeaway from all of this? According to Maslow, it all comes down to a single fundamental choice that we face over and over again every single day of our lives.
It all comes down to this: safety versus growth. Every choice you make is either a step back into the safety of your comfort zone or a step forward into growth. The safety choice means avoiding risk, sticking with what's familiar. The growth choice means embracing a challenge, stepping into the unknown, and being willing to learn from it. And every single time you choose growth, you take one more step up that mountain towards self-actualization. And listen, this isn't just some nice, feel-good idea. Modern research totally backs this up. People who consistently choose the path of growth, they report being healthier, happier, and more fulfilled. It really is the secret ingredient. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to think about. Using Maslow's pyramid as your map, where are you on your climb right now? Are you still shoring up your foundation of safety? Are you searching for connection? Are you standing at the peak, reaching for your full potential? What does that very next step on your climb look like for you?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really powerful idea from the psychologist Carl Rogers. It's an idea that might just change how you see yourself and what you think you're capable of. So, let's get right into it. Just think about that for a second. Who would you be if you didn't have to worry about what anyone else thought? That question, it gets to the very heart of Carl Rogers' work. He believed that for a lot of us, there's a huge gap between who we really are and who we think we're supposed to be. This explainer's all about understanding that gap, and more importantly, figuring out how to close it.
But to really get this idea, you kind of have to get the man behind it. Because Carl Rogers' own life was this incredible journey toward the very thing he became famous for: authenticity. I mean, just look at his early life. It was all about strict external rules, a world filled with shoulds and should-nots. So when he enters the seminary, he's looking for a set path, fixed beliefs. But then he makes this huge pivot. He leaves. He chooses the freedom to ask his own questions over a doctrine that gives him all the answers. That move, from looking for authority outside himself to trusting his own internal compass,
That became the absolute bedrock of his entire theory.
And that massive personal shift? Well, it led him to a pretty radical conclusion, that there is one single powerful force that drives not just us, but every living thing on this planet.
He called it the actualizing tendency. Think about it like a plant. It doesn't need to be told to grow towards the sun, it just does. It's this built-in, innate drive. And Rogers said, hey, we're the same way. At our very core, we're not just a bundle of dark urges or a simple machine of rewards and punishments. Nope. We are fundamentally built to grow, to become the best versions of ourselves.
Okay, but hold on. Let's really think about that quote. If this drive to grow is our only motive, if we're all wired to move toward our potential, then what's the problem? Why do so many of us feel stuck or anxious or like we're just not living the life we're meant to?
Well, according to Rogers, the problem isn't something out there in the world. The problem is in here. It's a deep internal conflict that puts the brakes on our natural growth.
He said we're all living with this constant tension, this tug of war between two different selves. On one side, you've got your real self. That's who you actually are, based on your own gut feelings and experiences. But then there's the ideal self. And that self, well, it's built out of all the shoulds we pick up from our parents, our friends, from society. It's the version of us that whispers, if you just act this way, or get that job, or look like that, then you'll finally be good enough.
And the gap between those two selves? Rogers had a name for it. Incongruence. It's not just a concept, it's a feeling. It's that knot in your stomach, that feeling of anxiety, that sense that you're not being true to yourself. And it's so uncomfortable that our minds build these massive defensive walls to keep us from even having a look at it.
We basically cook up two main strategies to protect ourselves. The first is distortion. This is when we take reality and just twist it a little so it fits with who we think we should be. I didn't get the promotion because my boss has an in for me, not maybe I wasn't qualified. The other one is just straight up denial, where we pretend something threatening never even happened. We just refuse to let it in.
So, that's the problem. The million-dollar question then is, how do we start tearing down those walls? How do we bridge that gap and get back on that natural path of growth?
For Rogers, the answer wasn't some complicated technique. It was actually pretty simple. It's all about our relationships. He laid out these 3 essential conditions for growth. First, genuineness, just being real with people. Second, acceptance, what he famously called unconditional positive regard. Basically, valuing someone for exactly who they are, no strings attached. And third, empathy, really truly trying to feel what it's like to be in their shoes.
And here's the kicker. These aren't tricks you learn or tools you use on people. They're ways of being with someone that create a space that feels psychologically safe. Because when someone gives that to us, when they're genuine, accepting, and they try to understand us, it gives us the courage to finally drop our defenses, take an honest look at our real self, and maybe, just maybe, start offering that same acceptance to ourself.
So let's say this process works. What happens then? What does it actually look like when we become more congruent, when our real self and our ideal self start to line up? Honestly, the results are pretty amazing. We get less defensive, we can put down the shield, we become more open to all of life's experiences, the good and the bad. We stop living by everyone else's rules and start trusting our own judgment. That background hum of anxiety starts to fade, and because we're being more real, our relationships get deeper and more meaningful.
And look, this isn't just some feel-good theory from the 1950s. Decades of modern research have totally backed this up. Scientists who study what's now called self-discrepancy theory have found a really strong link between having a big gap between your real and ideal self and having higher levels of anxiety and depression. It's a real thing.
And this stuff has real-world consequences, seriously. This one study, for example, found that college students who had a bigger gap between their real and ideal selves were more likely to drink more heavily. It's almost like they were trying to numb that painful inner conflict. So you see, this internal struggle for authenticity, it directly shapes our choices and our behaviors every single day.
So, in the end, Rogers' work leaves all of us with a powerful, personal challenge. The journey to your true self isn't about becoming someone new or different. It's about having the courage to create the conditions in your own mind and in your relationships where the person you already are can finally feel safe enough to come out.
Today, we're going to dive deep into the work of a really fascinating thinker, the existential psychologist Rollo May. Now, here's a guy who looked at all the stress and anxiety of the modern world and saw something totally different. Not a sickness we needed to cure, but a challenge. A challenge that we all have to face. And it all starts with a feeling I bet is pretty familiar to a lot of you. You know that feeling, right? Like you're just adrift. Maybe you feel like you're watching your own life from the outside instead of actually being in it. If that sounds familiar, you're definitely not alone. In fact, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century said that this exact feeling is the defining illness of our time. And that psychologist was Rollo May. He looked at the widespread apathy, the sense of emptiness that so many people feel, and he said, hey, this isn't just a personal problem you're having. He saw it as a symptom of a much, much bigger condition, a kind of sickness that had taken hold of the modern world. So before we can get to May's solution, we have to really understand the problem he was trying to solve. What exactly is this sickness that he saw all around us? He gave it a name, alienation. And listen, this is way more than just feeling lonely on a Friday night. May described it as a deep, threefold split in our lives. It's a separation from the natural world around us, a separation from the people we're supposed to connect with, and maybe the most painful one, a separation from our own true selves. To make this clear, May broke down our existence into 3 distinct worlds. First, you have the Umwelt. That's the world around you, your connection to nature, the environment, even your own body. Then there's the Mitwelt. That's the with world, the world of other people, your relationships. And finally, the Eigenwelt, which is your own world, your inner life, your relationship with yourself. Alienation, according to May, is what happens when those 3 connections start to fray and break apart. So you might be wondering, how did May come up with such a heavy diagnosis? Well, this wasn't just some theory he came up with in a comfortable office. His most powerful ideas were actually born from a deeply personal and life-threatening crisis. You see, after spending his youth as a traveling artist in Europe, May's life was turned completely upside down. He got tuberculosis and had to spend years locked away in a sanatorium. It was there, lying in bed, facing the very real possibility that he might not make it, that he was forced to grapple with the biggest questions of all. He gave a name to what he was facing, non-being. It's that cold gut punch of a realization that our existence is incredibly fragile. It's the awareness of the nothingness that's always just on the other side of life. And for May, a huge paradox became crystal clear. To truly appreciate what it means to be, you first have to stare right into the face of not being. And this is where it all connects. May argued that this dread of non-being, this fundamental fear of nothingness, isn't just some random phobia. No, he said it is the source, the root cause of all our anxiety. It's like the engine humming quietly beneath all the other fears we have. But, and this is a huge but, May didn't think all anxiety was bad. Far from it. He made this brilliant distinction between 2 types. On one side, you have neurotic anxiety. That's the destructive, paralyzing kind that happens when we try to run away from that fear of non-being. But on the other side, you have normal anxiety. And that's the feeling that comes with freedom, with growth, with change. It's a sign that you're actually alive and engaging with life. Okay, so that idea brings us to the absolute heart of Rollo May's philosophy. It's this beautiful, powerful tension that every single one of us lives with, the constant dance between our freedom to choose and the destiny we've been handed. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. It's not freedom versus destiny. It's that they need each other. They give each other meaning. Think about it. Without limits, without our destiny, our freedom would just be chaos. And without freedom, our limits would just be a prison. May also helped us understand freedom in a much deeper way. He said there are really 2 kinds. There's existential freedom, which is the freedom of doing, our ability to act, to make choices out in the world. But then there's essential freedom, which is the freedom of being. And this one might be even more important. It's your inner power to choose your attitude, your response, no matter what's happening on the outside. So what about destiny? It's really important to get this right. For May, destiny is not fate. It's not that your life is already written for you. Not at all. Destiny is simply the givens of your life. It's the fact that you're mortal. It's your natural talents, your built-in limitations, the family and country you were born into. It's the raw clay that your freedom gets to shape. Okay, so if we're living in this constant push and pull between freedom and destiny, with this background hum of anxiety, what are we supposed to do? Well, May's answer is profound. It requires what he famously called the courage to create.
When May thought about the purpose of therapy, it wasn't about making people feel happy or comfortable. It was about making them more fully human. The process looked like this. First, help people truly see and feel their own freedom. Second, help them deepen their conscious experience of just being alive. And third, empower them to take full, radical responsibility for the life they are building with their choices. So here it is, the main takeaway. The whole point isn't to get rid of anxiety. That's impossible. And honestly, it would mean you've stopped growing. The real goal, the courageous goal, is to face that normal anxiety, the one that comes with every meaningful choice, and to learn how to use its energy to build a life of your own meaning.
And that brings us to the final powerful question that Rollo May leaves for every one of us. Knowing the givens of your life, working within the limits of your destiny, who will you choose to be? How will you use your freedom? That, right there, is the courageous work of a lifetime.
You know, so many personality theories out there seem to focus on what's wrong with us. But Gordon Allport, he was way more fascinated by what goes right. So today, we're going to dive into his incredible, groundbreaking work on the unique, healthy individual.
So let's just start with the really big question, the one that pretty much drove Allport's entire career. What does a healthy personality actually look like? I mean, think about it. In a field that was so often obsessed with neurosis and dysfunction, he really dedicated himself to understanding psychological maturity.
Okay, so Allport's main idea was, well, it was a pretty radical break from what everybody else was doing at the time. He basically said, hey, to understand people, maybe we shouldn't spend all our time digging around for hidden motives from their childhood. Instead, he argued, let's just listen to them. Let's focus on what's driving them consciously, right now, and the stable traits that make them who they are.
And this whole approach is the foundation of what we call dispositional theory. Now, it sounds kind of fancy, but the idea is actually super intuitive. It's the view that our personality is made up of these stable, internal things called traits. You know, characteristics that guide how we act and feel, pretty consistently, no matter what's going on around us.
All right, so that's the theory. But this is where it gets really practical. See, Allport wasn't just some academic with his head in the clouds. He wanted to pin down what a psychologically mature person actually looks like. So, what did he come up with? What are the criteria?
Well, he laid out a few key hallmarks. First up, emotional security and self-acceptance. You know, just being comfortable in your own skin. Next, having a realistic view of the world around you. And also, being problem-oriented, which means you're focused on solving things out there in the world, not just on yourself. But that last point he made, that one is arguably the big one.
Yeah, exactly. For Allport, the secret sauce, the thing that ties it all together, is having a unifying philosophy of life. It's that sense of purpose, that North Star, that gives everything else meaning and direction. It's what makes all the other pieces of a healthy personality just click into place.
So, a question for you. How on earth do you study one single individual in that kind of depth? Allport's method was, well, it was totally unique. Forget a sterile lab. He used a mailbox. And it led to a case study that went on for more than 10 years.
Get this. For 11.5 years, Allport and his wife Ada exchanged letters with a woman they gave the pseudonym Jenny Gove Masterson. Now, they weren't her therapist or anything like that. They were just a sounding board, a neutral ear. And over the course of 301 letters, they got this unbelievably detailed front-row seat to the inner workings of her personality.
And if you look at the timeline, it's pretty revealing. The letters start, everything's going along, and then, a few years in, tragedy strikes. Her son Ross dies suddenly. And for the next 8 years, man, her letters are just full of suspicion, hostility. She's blaming everyone else for her problems. But here's the key thing. Despite this huge, life-altering event, her core personality, it didn't really seem to budge.
Ada Allport, his wife, summed it up perfectly after Jenny passed away. She said, in the end, she was the same, only more so. Wow, I mean, what a powerful statement. This whole long-term study was a huge piece of evidence for that dispositional view, the idea that our core traits are just remarkably stable, even when life throws the worst at us.
So, that was decades ago. But Allport's ideas, especially that whole unifying philosophy of life thing, they didn't just disappear. Nope, they've had this incredible legacy.
And what's really cool is that modern science is now picking up these concepts and testing them in ways Allport probably never even dreamed of, like connecting them directly to our physical health.
So Allport dug into this unifying philosophy idea, and he broke it down in a really interesting way, specifically around religion. He saw two different approaches. The first is intrinsic. This is where your belief is this deeply held core part of you. It's a genuine master motive. It's just how you live. And then there's the extrinsic orientation. This is where religion is more of a tool, right? It's a means to an end, maybe for security or social connections or comfort.
And this distinction, it was absolutely crucial for him. He saw that deep intrinsic commitment as a real sign of maturity. But it also helped him solve a puzzle that bothered him. He noticed that a lot of very prejudiced people were also frequent churchgoers. How could that be? Well, he suggested their extrinsic orientation was the answer. They were using religion, not living it. It was about feeling secure and fitting in, not about a deeply held philosophy of compassion.
Okay, so this leads us right up to today with a really mind-blowing question. Can these different ways of believing, can they actually have a physical, measurable effect on our bodies? Could your philosophy of life literally change your blood pressure?
No, a study by a guy named Kevin Masters and his team did exactly that. They put Allport's theory to a very modern test. They found a group of older adults and figured out who had an intrinsic orientation and who had an extrinsic one. Then they gave them some light stress tasks, like doing math problems, and they hooked them up to a blood pressure monitor. Super simple, super direct.
And the results? Whoa, they were not subtle. Just look at this. The group with the extrinsic orientation, their blood pressure shot way up during the stressful tasks. But the intrinsic group, a much, much smaller reaction. I mean, they were facing the exact same stress, but their bodies were handling it in a profoundly healthier way. So what's the bottom line here? The research strongly suggests that having one of these deeply internalized intrinsic belief systems acts like a physical shield, a buffer against the stress of everyday life. It's amazing. Allport's psychological idea turned out to have a clear, measurable, real-world impact on our bodies.
Okay, let's pull this all together. What are the big takeaways? First, personality is built on stable internal traits. Second, psychological maturity isn't just some vague idea. It's a definable, achievable thing. Third, and this is huge, our deepest beliefs can actually affect our physical health. And maybe most importantly, Allport championed the simple but profound idea that every single one of us is unique and worthy of study on our own terms.
And that leaves us with one final thought. And it really gets to the core of Allport's optimistic view of us. So many theories are obsessed with looking backward, at our past, but Allport's work is always pushing us to look forward. So I'll leave you with this question. Are we really just a product of our past, or are we defined by the person we are choosing right now to become?
Who are you? I mean, really, who are you? It's probably one of the biggest questions we can ask ourselves. For centuries, people have tried to figure out that unique mix of thoughts, feelings, and actions that makes you, well, you. And more recently, psychologists have been trying to turn that big philosophical question into a scientific one. They've been trying to draw a map of human personality.
But let's be real for a second. That sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? How could any scientific model possibly capture all your little quirks, your deepest hopes, the very essence of who you are? It's a huge challenge for sure, but the goal isn't to predict your every single move. It's about finding the underlying structure, the key dimensions that kind of shape all of us. I like to think of it like mapping a giant, undiscovered continent. The first explorers, they draw these really rough sketches. Then, later adventurers come along and start filling in all the details. And that's pretty much what happened in the science of personality. So today, we're going to follow the story of these psychological map makers, from their first early blueprints to the much more detailed charts we use today. So our story starts with one of the boldest of those early explorers, a guy named Eysenck. He was a real pioneer who was convinced that all the crazy complexity of our personalities could be boiled down to just a few fundamental, even biological dimensions. His work really created the first truly scientific blueprint for what personality looks like. But here's the funny thing. Eysenck never even wanted to be a psychologist. It's a great story. He fled Nazi Germany and ended up in England, and he went to enroll at the University of London to study his true passion, which was physics. But they told him he didn't have the right prerequisites. So he asks, okay, what scientific subject am I qualified for? The answer? Psychology. And just like that, because of some paperwork, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century started his career completely by accident.
So what did Eysenck's map actually look like? Well, he proposed that our personalities are built on three main super factors. First, there's extroversion versus introversion, basically how outgoing and sociable you are. Eysenck thought this was literally biological, finding that introverts' brains are naturally more stimulated. Second, you've got neuroticism versus emotional stability, which is all about your tendency to feel negative stuff like anxiety or worry. And third, there's psychoticism. Now hold on, this doesn't mean psychosis like in a clinical sense. It's more about traits like nonconformity, being impulsive, and even creativity. With just those three dimensions, Eysenck gave us a really powerful, if simple, starting blueprint.
Eysenck's three-factor model was a huge deal, but it wasn't the end of the story. The next generation of researchers, especially Robert McCrae and Paul Costa, took his blueprint and started to refine it, adding more detail and a lot more nuance to the personality map.
And honestly, this is how science is supposed to work. It's not about one person being right and someone else being wrong. It's a team effort, building over time. Each new theory stands on the shoulders of the ones that came before it, correcting things, expanding on ideas, and just refining our understanding. McCrae and Costa didn't throw out Eysenck's work, they built right on top of it. You can really see the evolution right here. Eysenck's extroversion and neuroticism, they're still key parts of the new model. But McCrae and Costa expanded the map into what we now all call the Big Five traits. They are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. A lot of people remember it by the acronym OCEAN. This more detailed five-factor model is, hands down, the most widely accepted and used map of personality in psychology today. Okay, so we've got these maps. They're interesting academic ideas. But so what? Do they actually tell us anything useful about our lives? Do these traits on a piece of paper actually predict what's going to happen out here in the real world? Well, the answer is a huge, resounding yes. And this is where it all gets really, really interesting. This isn't just about sticking labels on people. The different dimensions on this personality map have been shown over and over again to be incredibly powerful predictors of really important things in life. Everything from your health and happiness to how well you do in school and at your job.
Check this out. A major study by researchers Knoftel and Robbins looks at over 10,000 students, and it just perfectly illustrates this point. So what they find? The single biggest personality predictor of a student's GPA in both high school and college wasn't how smart they were, it was their level of conscientiousness. The connection they found, which you can see here, is just incredibly strong.
So what in the world is conscientiousness? Well, it's the trait that describes people who are hardworking, organized, dependable, and on time. But it's not just that they work hard, it's how they work. People who are high in this trait, they tend to set goals, they manage their time really well, and they can push past distractions. I mean, that's basically a recipe for success in school, right? Their personality is directly fueling their achievement. So let's bring all of this back home, back to you. After hearing all this, you might be thinking, okay, so am I just a collection of 5 scores? Is my destiny already written down by my traits? But trust me, that is completely the wrong way to look at it. Here is the most important thing to take away from all of this. A map doesn't tell you where you have to go. It just shows you the terrain. These trait theories, they're not meant to put you in a box or to limit what you can do. They're a tool for self-awareness. Understanding your own personal map, your natural tendencies, that's the first step to navigating your own life more effectively and really growing as a person. Because in the end, the map is just a guide. It shows you the mountains and the valleys of your own personality, but you are the explorer. You're the one holding the compass. Knowing where you're starting from doesn't decide your final destination. It just helps you chart a much better course. The real power isn't in the map itself. It's in how you decide to use it. All right, today we're diving into the world of B.F. Skinner. You've probably heard the name. He's a psychologist whose ideas about human behavior were, well, they were so out there, so radical, that they've been sparking arguments for decades. And right at the very heart of all that controversy, there's this really disturbing rumor, one that involves his own daughter. Yeah, this is the question, the one that's haunted his legacy for, decades now? Did B.F. Skinner really, truly raise his own daughter in a box? Treating her like one of his lab animals? It's this powerful, kind of horrifying image of a cold, detached scientist, and man, has it stuck around. But is it true? What's the real story here? So on one hand, you've got the myth, right? This image of a cruel, heartless experiment. But then, on the other hand, there's the reality. And the reality is an invention born not out of cruelty, but out of care. It was actually an attempt to build a safer, a healthier world for his child. So to really get a handle on who Skinner was, we've got to peel back the myth and find the man. Okay, so let's just debunk this thing once and for all. The device everyone talks about, it was never, ever a Skinner box for a human. It was an invention with a much, much gentler name. It was called the baby tender.
So what was the baby tender? Well, think of it like a high-tech, climate-controlled crib. Seriously, it had this big window, a constant supply of fresh, warm air. It was designed to be a totally safe environment, both physically and, psychologically. The whole idea was to free up parents from some of that constant, tedious labor of early childcare. And yeah, his daughter, Debbie, she actually used it for 2.5 years. And when she finally outgrew it, well, in a move that is just classic B.F. Skinner, he turned it into a pigeon cage. You can't make this stuff up.
And this baby tender, it was really just one chapter in what was a truly wild and unconventional career. I mean, you go from his foundational book on behavior back in '38 to a top-secret project during World War II developing, get this, pigeon-guided missiles. Yeah, you heard that right. He was always pushing the boundaries. And by 1948, he's publishing novels about utopian societies. This guy's work was provocative from the absolute beginning to the very end. All right, so now that we've kind of cleared the air on that whole baby-in-a-box myth, we can finally get to the core of Skinner's actual work. Because it was never really about the box itself. It was about the science that inspired the box, what he called the science of consequences. Now, Skinner didn't just pull these ideas out of thin air. He wasn't working in a vacuum. He was actually building on the really bold claims of other psychologists, like John B. Watson. Watson famously said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee I can train any one of them to become any kind of specialist." I mean, that's a huge claim. And that is the very essence of radical behaviorism, this belief that our environment, our world, is the ultimate architect of who we become.
And this is a really key point about Skinner's work that a lot of people miss. He never ever denied that we have thoughts and feelings. Of course we do. He just argued that they weren't the cause of our actions. His whole thing was, for psychology to be a real science, it had to focus on what you can actually observe and measure, right? You can't put a feeling under a microscope, but you can definitely observe and measure a behavior, and that was his entire focus. So his entire theory, really, the whole shebang, it all hinges on one single, incredibly powerful concept: operant conditioning. And the idea is actually pretty simple. It's that what happens after we do something is what determines whether or not we'll do it again. That's it. The consequence is everything. So, okay, how does this actually work? How does this shaping happen? What are the actual tools that operant conditioning uses to mold what we do? Well, it really boils down to a super simple 3-step process. First, you have a behavior. Anything, really. Second, a consequence follows that behavior. Could be a reward, could be a punishment. And third, that consequence directly changes how likely you are to do that same behavior again in the future. Skinner argued that this simple loop, this is the engine that drives all learning. But Skinner saw this engine working on a much bigger scale too. He said there are really 3 major forces that shape all of human behavior. The first is natural selection, our deep evolutionary programming. The second is the cultural practices of whatever society we happen to be born into. And the third, the most personal one, is our own unique history of reinforcement, all the little rewards and punishments we've experienced throughout our own lives. Okay, to really get this, we have to be super clear on the terms because they can be a little tricky. Positive reinforcement is when you add something to a situation to increase a behavior. Think about giving a dog a treat when it sits. Simple. Now, punishment in this context is when you add an aversive event to decrease a behavior, like, say, scolding a child for drawing on the wall. See? One encourages, one discourages. And this difference between reinforcement and punishment, it was absolutely crucial for Skinner, especially when he started thinking bigger, about society as a whole. And, well, he had some pretty radical ideas about which one of these tools we should be using and which one we should probably just throw away. Okay, so Skinner was deeply critical of punishment, and not just for moral reasons, but for a really practical one. He thought it was just plain inefficient.
He argued that all punishment really does is teach you what not to do, but it never shows you a better alternative. And even worse, it creates all these nasty side effects like fear, anxiety, guilt. Think about it. A kid who gets punished for teasing someone might stop teasing, sure, but have they learned how to play nicely? No, they've just learned to be afraid.
So, if Skinner was so against punishment, what was his alternative? I mean, what's the other option? This is where things get really big. This is where he takes his principles and applies them to all of society. And trust me, this is where his ideas get truly, truly radical. He actually wrote a novel about it called Walden 2. And in this book, he basically sketched out a blueprint for a perfect society, a utopia. He imagined a community that was completely engineered from the ground up around the principles of positive reinforcement. His belief was that if you could just carefully design the environment and all its consequences, you could literally build a world full of happier, more productive people, and you'd never, ever need to use punishment to do it. And this whole grand vision, this new society, it all comes back to those three big forces we talked about: our personal history, our evolution, and our culture. For Skinner, these weren't just abstract ideas for a textbook. No, he saw them as actual, tangible levers you could pull to literally engineer a better world. You know, this leads to what might be one of Skinner's most challenging ideas of all: his complete rejection of traditional morality. He basically argued that no one is born good or evil. Those are just labels we slap on behaviors. To him, an altruistic person is just someone whose environment has consistently rewarded them for being altruistic. A cowardly person? Someone whose environment has reinforced cowardice. For Skinner, it was all a product of your history, not some kind of inner character. And that brings us to the big, unsettling question that sits right at the heart of all of Skinner's work. If everything we do is just the end result of our genes, our culture, and a lifetime of rewards and punishments, then how much free will do we really have? I mean, are we really the architects of our own lives? Or are we just kind of responding to all the forces that have shaped us? That's the question Skinner leaves us with, and it's a tough one.
Okay, today we're jumping into the work of psychologist Albert Bandura. He's a real giant in the field, and his social cognitive theory completely changed how we think about learning, behavior, and even morality. And the wild part? It all started pretty much by accident.
So let me just ask you this. How much of your life, your job, who you hang out with, the things you love, is just the result of pure random chance? It's a question Bandura himself got really interested in, probably because his own career got kicked off by a total twist of fate.
So the story goes, when Bandura was in college, he was in this carpool with a bunch of pre-med and engineering students who all had these ridiculously early classes. He needed something to do to kill time before his own classes started, so he just randomly picked a psychology course to fill the gap. And boom, he was hooked. That one little scheduling coincidence changed everything for him.
This experience was so powerful that he actually gave it a name, a fortuitous event. It's basically a chance encounter, a totally unplanned moment that has this huge outsized impact on the direction your life takes. And this idea that chance is a huge player in our lives, well, it became a really important piece of his much bigger theory.
So what was that big idea? Well, Bandura argued that our behavior isn't just a one-way street. It's not just our environment pushing us around, and it's not just our internal thoughts pulling the strings. He saw it as this dynamic three-way interaction. Now, the official name is triadic reciprocal causation. I know, it sounds super academic, but the idea is actually something we all kind of get. It just means that who we are is the result of this constant back and forth dance between three key things. And what are those three things? First, you've got the person. That's all your internal stuff, your thoughts, your beliefs, your feelings. Then there's the environment, your physical space, the people around you. And finally, your behavior, the actual things you do. The absolute key here is that they all influence each other, all the time. Your thoughts shape your actions can change your environment, and your environment, in turn, can change how you think. Let's make it super simple. Picture a kid begging for a brownie. The begging itself, that's the behavior. The fact that their dad is right there, that's the environment. And the kid's little thought in their head that says, hey, begging usually works on this guy, that's the person factor. You know, if the dad gives in and hands over the brownie, it reinforces the kid's belief, which makes that begging behavior way more likely to happen again in that environment. See? It's all connected, a three-way street.
So how on earth did Bandura go about proving that we learn so much just from watching what's happening around us? Well, this leads us to his most famous and, let's be honest, his most controversial study, the Bobo doll experiment. The whole experiment was designed to tackle a question that we are still wrestling with today. Does watching violence actually make us more violent? See, back then, a lot of people believed in this idea of catharsis, that watching someone else be aggressive kind of gets it out of your system. Bandura, he wasn't so sure. The setup was really simple. One group of kids watched an adult just go town on this inflatable clown doll named Bobo, punching it, kicking it, yelling at it. Another group of kids, the control group, didn't see any of that. Then each child was put in a room all alone with that same Bobo doll. The big question was, what were they going to do? The results were absolutely staggering. The kids who saw the adult being aggressive weren't just a little more aggressive. No, they performed the exact same aggressive things they had just watched. They showed about twice as much aggression as the kids who hadn't seen the model. They had learned the behavior, step by step, just by watching. This experiment just completely shattered that whole catharsis theory. It was powerful proof that watching violence isn't some harmless release. Instead, it can actually provide a blueprint, a script, for our own future behavior. It was one of the first major warnings about the potential real-world impact of violent media. But Bandura's theory goes even deeper, and it gets into some pretty dark territory. It also gives us a framework for understanding how seemingly good, normal people can end up doing truly awful things. He called this the moral off switch. The technical term for it is moral disengagement, and it's basically a set of psychological loopholes we use to convince ourselves that our own ethical rules don't really apply in a certain situation. It's what lets a person act inhumanely without feeling that crushing guilt. So one of the most common ways we do this is by displacing responsibility. We just tell ourselves, hey, it's not my fault. I was just following orders, or someone else is really to blame. A perfect everyday example is an employee who messes up but immediately blames their boss for their own poor performance. By passing the buck, they get to sidestep feeling accountable. Now, a much more sinister way this works is by blaming the victim. This is where a perpetrator will actually justify what they did by claiming the victim had it coming. The source material gives the really disturbing example of a rapist blaming his victim's clothing. It's a horrifying cognitive trick that allows the perpetrator to see their own terrible act as a justified response, effectively flipping their moral switch to the off position. So, after all this, chance encounters, aggressive dolls, and these moral off switches, what's the big takeaway from Bandura's work? I think it's this. We are all the time, both the student and the teacher. We are both learners and models. So let's boil it down. First, what we see really matters. We learn so much just by observing other people. Second, we are not just puppets. Yeah, our environment shapes us, but we also have the power to shape our environment. Third, never ever underestimate the power of pure chance to completely change your life. And finally, and this one is so important, we have to remember that we all have this capacity for moral disengagement, and we've got to be vigilant about keeping that switch on. You know, Bandura's work was groundbreaking in a world with like 3 TV channels. But today, we are swimming in a literal ocean of digital models, influencers, creators, random people online. And all of that leaves us with a really critical question to ask ourselves. In this world of endless models, who are you choosing to learn from? All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are digging into a really fundamental question in psychology. How do we learn all the complicated stuff we do? I mean, is it really just trial and error, or is something else going on? You know, for a long time, a lot of psychologists were all about behaviorism. The idea was pretty simple. We only learn from direct rewards and punishments. You do something good, you get a cookie. You touch a hot stove, you get burned. Makes sense, right? But that whole idea kind of falls apart when you think about really complex stuff. How do we learn a language? Or how to be empathetic? We pick that stuff up way too fast for it to just be trial and error. So, enter Albert Bandura. In the 1960s, this psychologist comes along and completely flips the script. He puts forward this, revolutionary idea. He said, hey, what if one of the most powerful ways we learn is just by watching other people? And he gave it a name. Observational learning. Think about it. It's the idea that you don't actually have to be the one touching the hot stove to learn that it's hot. You can just watch someone else do it and go, ooh, okay, not going to do that. It's like learning from their experience, their successes, and definitely their mistakes. This was a huge deal, a total cognitive shortcut, and it really did change everything.
Okay, so having a cool theory is one thing, right? But you've got to prove it. So to put his idea to the test, Bandura and his team came up with what is now one of the most famous and, kind of controversial experiments in the history of psychology. I'm talking about the Bobo doll study.
The setup itself was just genius in its simplicity. They brought a bunch of young kids into a playroom. Some of the kids watched an adult just playing quietly with the toys, but the other group, they watched an adult get up and just go to town on this big inflatable clown doll named Bobo. I mean, they were hitting it, kicking it, yelling at it. And then the researchers just left the kids alone in the room with the doll to see what would happen next.
But Bandura took it a step further. He wanted to know, does it matter what kind of model you see? So they had different groups of kids. One group saw a real live adult being aggressive, another saw a movie of that same adult, and a third group saw a cartoon character doing it. And of course, they had a control group that didn't see any model at all, so they had something to compare the results to. Now, you got to understand the backdrop for this. At the time, there was this really popular idea called catharsis. The theory was that if you watch someone else be aggressive, it kind of gets it out of your system, right? Like a release valve that makes you less aggressive. So Bandura's experiment was basically a direct shot at that whole belief. All right, so this is the big moment, the million-dollar question. What happened when those kids were left alone with Bobo? Did watching all that aggression make them calmer? Did it have that cathartic effect? Well, the results were, let's just say, incredibly clear and pretty dramatic. The kids who saw the aggressive model weren't just a little more aggressive. No, they were about twice as aggressive as the kids in the control group. It wasn't just imitation, it was a huge increase in aggressive behavior. This just brilliantly showed the raw power of observational learning. That whole catharsis theory, it didn't just fall flat, it was totally demolished. And get this, it wasn't just random aggression. The kids were copying the models with scary precision. I'm talking kicking, punching, hitting the doll with a mallet. They were even using the exact same words the adults had used. They had learned an entire script for aggression just from watching for a few minutes. But here's the thing. Bandura's whole theory is way more sophisticated than just monkey see, monkey do. The Bobo doll experiment was really just one piece of a much bigger puzzle he was putting together about how our personalities work and how we navigate the world around us. He came up with this concept called triadic reciprocal causation. Okay, I know that sounds super academic, a real mouthful. But the idea behind it is actually pretty simple and intuitive. It's basically saying that our lives aren't just shaped by one thing. Instead, there's this constant back and forth dance between three major factors. Let's break it down using the experiment. You've got the environment, which is the kid seeing an adult punch the doll. That influences the person, their internal thoughts and beliefs, making them think, oh, I guess that's how you're supposed to play with that toy. That thought then drives their behavior. They start punching the doll too. And here's the cool part. That action now changes their environment, and the whole loop starts over again. It's this nonstop feedback loop where our thoughts, actions, and surroundings are all shaping each other, all the time. So let's get to the takeaway. Why does this experiment from over 60 years ago still matter so much? I mean, why are we still talking about a poor inflatable clown getting beaten up in a psychology lab? Well, for one, it's powerful proof that what we see really does shape what we do. This study was some of the first hard evidence in that huge debate about media violence, a debate that's obviously still going on today. But on a deeper level, it shows us something amazing about ourselves. We're not just passive products of our environment, you know? We're not just sponges. Our own behavior actively shapes the world around us. We are, in a very real sense, both the artists and the canvases of our own lives. And that really leaves us with a big final thought to chew on. If we're all constantly learning by watching, it kind of makes you stop and ask, doesn't it? Who are the models shaping your life right now? And maybe just as important, what are you modeling for the people who are watching you?
All right, today we're jumping into one of the most, unique and empowering theories of personality out there, the work of psychologist George Kelly. He had this really radical idea about who we are and, how we actually operate in the world.
So let me just start with this question for you. Do you see yourself as just kind of passively reacting to whatever life throws at you, or are you something more? As Kelly would say, are you an active scientist constantly running experiments to figure out your world?
Okay, let's really get into this, because this is the core metaphor of Kelly's entire theory. You see, he didn't view people as just a bundle of drives or traits. No, he saw every single one of us as a scientist, trying to predict and control what happens in our lives.
Now, what's so cool about this is how it completely flips the script on a lot of traditional psychology. Instead of being pushed around by our history or our circumstances, Kelly was like, no, we're always reaching forward, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. We're explorers, not victims. It's all about looking ahead.
So if we're all scientists, what are our tools? What's in our toolkit? Well, Kelly called them personal constructs. These are the unique mental frameworks we build to make sense of everything and everyone around us.
Think of a construct like a transparent filter you place over reality, and each one is what he called bipolar. It has two sides, two poles. So for example, you might see people through a lens of kind versus cruel, or maybe you see situations as fair versus unfair, or even interesting versus boring. This is your own personal system for sorting and predicting your world.
And this slide just perfectly lays out the difference between Kelly and, say, more deterministic thinkers like Freud. For Freud, you're pretty much driven by your past. Your behavior today is an effect of some cause from way back when. But for Kelly, it's completely different. You're pulled by what you think is going to happen in the future. It's a huge shift from looking at past causes to being guided by future goals and predictions.
Okay, so you might be wondering, how do I even know what my personal constructs are? I mean, they're often so automatic, we don't even notice them. Well, Kelly developed this really clever tool for this exact purpose, famously known as the rep test. So here's how it works. It's pretty simple. You're given a list of roles, people in your life, and you pick 3 of them. Then you just think about what makes 2 of them similar to each other, but at the same time, different from that 3rd one. And that very distinction you make, well, that's one of your personal constructs, just popping right out into the open. Let's try an example. Say we take your mother, your father, and a teacher you disliked. Okay, how are 2 of them alike but different from the 3rd? You might go, well, my mother and father are both really nurturing while that teacher was just cold. And boom, there it is. You've just revealed the nurturing versus cold construct that you use to understand your social world. But what happens when our predictions go wrong? You know, when the world doesn't behave the way our constructs say it should. Well, according to Kelly, this is exactly where we start to feel things like anxiety, fear, and psychological distress. But here's the really important part. Kelly didn't see this distress as some kind of sickness or a sign that you're broken. Not at all. He saw it as valuable data. It's basically a flashing red light, a signal telling you, hey, your theory about the world is a little flawed here, and your mental toolkit, your constructs, they might need an update.
And Kelly made a really sharp distinction here. So imagine you're driving a little recklessly. Suddenly you see another car and you realize you might crash. That sudden jolt, that's fear. It requires an immediate, small change to a minor construct, like, I should probably slow down right now. But then, the realization that your recklessness could make you a criminal, or that you could actually harm someone, that feeling, that's threat. That shakes your core beliefs about who you are as a person. That requires a massive overhaul of your entire system.
And this all leads us to the most hopeful and, frankly, powerful part of Kelly's theory. Since we are the scientists who created our own constructs, we're also the ones who can change them. We have the power to write a whole new theory.
I mean, this quote really says it all, doesn't it? The past doesn't have to define you. Your current situation doesn't have to trap you. You always have the freedom to see things differently, to find new ways of looking at the world.
So, the ultimate takeaway is this. Your personal constructs are just theories. They're not facts set in stone. You can treat your life like your own personal laboratory. You can experiment with new ways of seeing people, new ways of tackling problems. You can literally decide to revise the story you tell yourself about who you are. And for Kelly, that constant, ongoing revision, well, that's the very definition of a growing, healthy life.
So I'll leave you with this to think about. What are those invisible lenses, those personal constructs, that you're using to predict and navigate your reality every single day? And maybe more importantly, are they still working for you?